So I want us to do a little time traveling this morning. Maybe back just, 2 weeks when there wasn't so much smoke in the air and I didn't have to worry about having a coughing fit from the air I was breathing. But further back than that, to 2003 or 4, ballpark. Actually, a little bit earlier than that. I was 14. And it was my first afternoon behind the wheel of a car for driver's ed. Before this afternoon, when we were driving home from school or whatnot, if the road that we lived on was empty, which it oftentimes was because, it was us, Granny and Pawpaw, and like 2 other families. So we would stop and Mom and Dad would let us drive back up to the house. It was like a long driveway. There was nothing there. But we at least got to feel, this is how the car stops. This is how the car goes. This is how the wheel turns. That was all we got. So everything beyond that was a new, even stop signs were a new experience for me this afternoon. Everything was entirely new. And my driving instructor had me going through a meandering residential neighborhood. And we don't have that many of those here in Edmonton. We have some curvy roads, but those tend to be a nice long curve this way, and then it's straight, and maybe it curves that, but it's very slow and very relaxed. This was more one of those you're doing this, and you can see a quarter mile down that way, but there's 15 curves between here and there. It was a long, curvy, meandering residential neighborhood. And I'm still trying to figure out so many things. And all of a sudden, for the first time ever, there's a car coming towards me in this residential neighborhood. And I get terrified. There's no center line marked on this little meandering neighborhood road. So I have no idea, where's the center of the road? I can't tell. I don't have this guy that I got used to on the range road kind of place. I'm like, what's going on? And I don't know how much space the car I'm in takes up. I haven't quite figured that out. This is 10 minutes into my first time behind the wheel outside of a long driveway situation. I was so focused on that car way down the road coming towards me and not wanting to hit them that I don't remember if I slowed down, if I let out the gas. I just remember thinking, where's the yellow line and how do I not hit that car? That's all I can remember thinking about. I was so focused on that car way down in the other lane coming towards me that I did not even register that there was a car parked on the side of the road, right there. And I didn't notice it until my driving instructor said, "Don't hit the parked car," with a little bit of urgency in his voice. I had veered over because I was so worried about that car way down there that I had veered over into the right side of the lane and I was about to rear end a non-moving vehicle. I was focused on something quite important way out there, not getting into a head-on collision on my first afternoon behind the wheel, kind of important. But I was so focused on that I missed something equally important and much more immediate. Thankfully, my driving instructor did give me that warning far enough in advance that I did not hit or rear end that parked car. And neither did I have a collision with that other car that was still way down there. All of that happened, though, because someone else helped me focus on what needed my attention in that very moment. Let's go back a little bit further in time, about 2,000 years, to somewhere around the town of Bethany with the resurrected Jesus. Imagine you're on that hillside with the disciples. Well, we assume it's a hillside. And he tells us that in a little bit we're going to be responsible for being witnesses, his witnesses in Jerusalem and Judea and Samaria and then to the ends of the earth. And when he finished saying that, he levitates up into the clouds and out of sight. And that's pretty fantastic. People don't levitate. We know people don't levitate at all unless we're watching a sci-fi movie, that's just, or fantasy maybe. So this is obviously a big deal and it's rather important. And the disciples are so focused on what just happened that they miss what is more immediate. They stand there gawking up at the sky until 2 people appear seemingly out of nowhere and say, why are you standing here looking up towards heaven? I mean, can you imagine? That's kind of a weird look. But the thing is, Jesus had just given them a job to do, but they're too busy staring up into the heavens to do that job. These two messengers might as well have said, don't just stand there looking for Jesus, go and do what he asked you to do. And I don't know about you, but those disciples are quite relatable in this moment. I mean, how many times have you ever been working on something and been so focused on one thing that you miss something else even more important and more immediate? I mean, I can do that all the time. Just ask Amy when she gets back from Oklahoma. We've all done this. We can all get that tunnel vision. We can all put on those blinders so we just don't get distracted or see anything else. We can all be so focused on not hitting that car way out there that's coming towards us that we miss the car that's parked right in front of us that we're about to rear end. That's why it's so incredibly important for us to pay attention to the people who show up and say, don't just stand there looking for Jesus. Do what he told you to do. Sometimes we want to do that, but other times we don't want to do that at all. A lot of times in church, we are comfortable looking up at heaven, but we're not comfortable doing what Jesus would have done. Or we say we shouldn't talk about that because it's divisive, or it could be political, or confusing, or involved, or difficult. I mean, I've only been pastoring for 10 years, and I couldn't tell you the number of times I've heard somebody say we shouldn't talk about that because of one of those reasons. This week, the Public Religion Research Institute released a study about the church in the U.S. And I know Canada is very different than the U.S. and that the specific data points are not transferable from this study to Canada. But the general trends and truths are more than likely quite similar, if not even a little bit more intense, maybe. A lot of this study was quite interesting. It is kind of long, but a lot of it was very interesting. So if anybody wants to read the whole study, let me know. I'll share it with you very happily. But there was one part of this study that stood out to me as quite relevant to these messengers showing up and appearing to the disciples and saying, don't just stand there looking for Jesus, do what he told you to do. And this is what that part said. Around 7 in 10 churchgoers, that's 71%, agree with the statement, providing a faith perspective on pressing social concerns is an important part of a church's role. So 71% of churchgoers agreed with that. And despite most churchgoers agreeing that the church should provide perspectives on social issues, less than half, 45%, agree with the statements congregations should get involved in social issues, even if that means challenging conversations about politics. So nearly 3/4 say that it's important for the church to provide perspective on social concerns, and less than half agree that congregations should get involved in those same social concerns. Again, that's based on studies and research in the U.S., but I feel like that's quite consistent here in Canada based on my conversations with people and hearing other things and sort of knowing generally where the church is here compared to the States. And I do think that number would go up a bit from 45%, but not significantly if there was no reference to the possibility of it being a political conversation. If it was just churches should get involved in social issues, maybe it would go up to 48 or 50%. Maybe. But can we imagine Jesus' life and ministry without him getting involved with social issues and social concerns? Or what we might think of as political or maybe just politicized issues today. This year, we're looking through the Gospel of Matthew for the most part. Like every Sunday, we'll be in Matthew if we're going to be in the Gospels. A few Johns tossed in there. So I went back and I just glanced through very quickly the Gospel of Matthew, just to notice how often Jesus not only provides perspective, but is directly involved in social issues and concerns. And like I just flipped through Matthew on my iPad and just jotted notes down, maybe 2-3 minutes of doing this, like very fast. In Matthew 2, we learn that Jesus is a refugee and an immigrant. The entire Holy Family flees to Egypt to escape violence and oppressive politics and policy. I don't think it gets more involved in a social issue than being a refugee who has fled violence. And if we were in the U.S., like that is an incredibly political statement of fact, that Jesus was a refugee and an immigrant. Not so much here, thank God. I like actually being able to talk about Scripture here in a freer way. At the end of Matthew 4, there's this really good short summary of Jesus' life and ministry. It's right before he starts the Sermon on the Mount. It says he taught in the synagogues. That's how it started. So quality education of adults and children, because that's where that would have happened for both adults and children. It goes on to say people brought him all those who had various kinds of diseases and he healed them. So healthcare, big social issue in Alberta today, and Canada as well. Both physical and mental, Jesus provided that kind of health care, and he even provided reproductive health care to women in the Gospel of Matthew. Jesus touched lepers. He touched the untouchable. He touched the social outcast, and he restored community to those who had been ostracized. And that speaks to many social issues we face today, not limited to, but including like addiction, homelessness, and poverty. And then Jesus went in and he healed the centurion's servant. He healed the servant of the very man that everyone in his group would have pointed the finger at and said, "You're the reason that everything is wrong with us." He healed that person's servant. He cared for the person everyone blamed for all of their woes. Then he realized there's more than I can do, so he sent his disciples to help with the need of the people. And he told them when he sent them out, and we're going to look at this at some point over the summer, don't take money or extra clothes with you, but depend on others that you meet for everything that you need. And Jesus fed the hungry many times, asking nothing in return. He started out by saying, "Hey, you, disciples, you feed them." And then Jesus himself fed them. He navigated the complexities of what we would call prejudice and racism today. That's the Canaanite woman in Matthew. If you want to go look at that, it's chapter 15. And Jesus told us to forgive each other's faults and shortcomings, something that we don't see happening, but I think needs to happen more in our society. And then Jesus talked about money a lot, including paying taxes and even going so far as to tell one rich man to sell all of his possessions and give everything to the poor. That's kind of a social issue. And then at the end of the gospel, we know that Jesus is wrongfully arrested and convicted and executed. So we can say he is the victim of the flaws and shortcomings of the criminal justice system of his day. And we know that ours is not perfect. And again, that's me just very quickly glancing through and taking a quick note of all the things that the times in the Gospel of Matthew that Jesus not just added perspective through his teachings, but actually engaged with social issues. And again, his teachings, so many of them are the perspective that goes around those actions. So in order for us to say that we as followers of Christ should not be engaged in social issues, we must ignore the fact that Jesus constantly and continually engaged with the issues of his day, even if, we must also acknowledge this, that he was forced to engage with them by others because they were trying to trick him or trap him, or because someone else desperately needed Jesus to be involved in their social issue, their social concern. As I talked about last week, the one thing Jesus wants us to do is to love each other. That is the one and only thing that we need to do to be faithful followers of Jesus. And we cannot fully do that if all we're doing is standing there looking up at the clouds waiting for Jesus to come back, like the disciples did all those years ago. Yes, Jesus did tell us to be ready when he returns. We should pay attention to that car way out yonder coming towards us so we don't hit it. And at the same time, we must be about the work that Jesus himself did. We must pay attention to the parked car right in front of us that we may rear end if we don't pay attention. It's so easy for the church to navel gaze or to stare up in the heavens for Jesus. That's one of the big critiques of the church with people who are not part of it, particularly younger folks, my age and younger. It's easy for us to do that, but to be like Jesus, we must love each other and love our neighbors, which means being involved with social issues. We must listen to the people around us who say, don't just stand there looking for Jesus. Do what Jesus would have done. Be Jesus in this time and place. And it's not that scary and it's not that difficult to do these things. At face value, when I'm saying this, I'll bet some of you, your heart rates went up a little bit. You'd be like, oh, we can't do that. Mine did when I thought about writing this sermon, so if I did that, I'm assuming y'all are doing that too. Like, getting involved in social issues sounds really scary, but it's not. It doesn't have to be. Difficult, yes. But everything we've done for the women and staff at Wings has been us engaging with the social issue of violence against women in this time and place. Becoming a weekend depot is how we're engaged with the social issue of food insecurity, which we know is becoming a bigger issue more and more of our neighbors are facing. It doesn't have to be scary. It's something that can be quite beautiful and life-giving and hopeful. Those two things in our food pantry that we've had for, a decade now? Same thing. Those are good ways for us to be the presence of Jesus in our time and in this place. Those are some of the ways that we have paid attention to the voices that say, don't just stand there looking up at the sky. And we also need to continue listening for the people who say, don't just stand there looking for Jesus. Go and do what he asked you, what he told you to do. But more than that, we need to be able to articulate and say not just what we're doing to engage the social issues faced by our society and by ourselves and by our neighbors, but why. Why is it important that we do it? Why is it important that we help Wings? Why is it important that we run a weekend depot? Why is that important to us? Knowing and being able to effectively communicate what we're about and why we're about those things, that's one of the keys to a thriving community, whether it be a church or any other organization. But in the church, being able to share what and why is the beginning of us sharing good news. And I remember Jesus saying, go and share the good news with people. And that's why we're going to have those intentional conversations this fall about discerning God's dream for us, for this congregation, to be Jesus's witnesses not in Jerusalem or Judea or Samaria or the far corners of the earth, but right here in Edmonton and in Mill Woods, in this corner of the world that we call home. So that we are not just standing here looking up at the sky for Jesus and not seeing the dream that Jesus has for you and for me, for us, right here in front of us. That's why we're having those conversations, to listen to those voices, so that we can decide, and not decide, but discover what is the beautiful dream that God has for us right now. And then follow through and be Jesus' presence right here where we are.